She arrived at his gate like something the desert had chewed up and spat out, still wearing her wedding dress. The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the red mesa that flanked the eastern edge of Marcus Ashford's property when his cattle dog, Runaway, started barking with a frantic urgency that made Marcus set down his hammer and look up from the fence post he'd been driving into the hard-packed earth. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, squinting toward the front gate some 50 yards away. At first he thought it might be a coyote that had wandered too close in the afternoon heat, which sometimes happened this time of year out here on the edge of the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1882. But then he saw the white, a flash of white, brilliant as a lamp flame against the burnt ochre of the trail, and then the white crumpled and went down like a cut flower. Marcus was moving before he'd made the conscious decision to move, his long legs eating up the distance between him and the gate in a loose, ground-covering stride. Runaway raced ahead of him, circling the figure at the gate with anxious energy, tail low, nose working. By the time Marcus reached her, he could see what she was, a young woman in a wedding dress, ivory and dusty, the lace at her hem torn and caked with red dirt. She'd collapsed sideways against the gatepost, her dark hair half unpinned and falling across her face. Her lips were cracked. Her hands, when he turned one over gently, were raw from the sun. "Hey," he said, his voice low and careful, the way he'd learned to speak around frightened horses. "Hey, can you hear me?" She made a sound. Something between a moan and the word yes. "All right," he said. "All right, I've got you." He gathered her up. She weighed almost nothing, he thought, his jaw tightening, and carried her through the gate and across the yard toward the house. His ranch house was a modest but solid structure, built from stone and timber in the territorial style, with a wide covered porch that ran along the front and a kitchen that still smelled of the coffee he'd made that morning. He shouldered open the front door and brought her to the narrow room off the kitchen that he'd always called the spare room, though it had never been used for anything but storing grain sacks and spare tack. He'd put a bed in there 2 years ago during a stretch of loneliness he preferred not to think about too carefully, and now he was grateful for it. He set her down on the bed and went straight for the water pitcher on the kitchen shelf. When he returned, she had her eyes open. They were dark brown, nearly black in the dim light of the room, and they tracked him with the alert, wary focus of someone who had recently learned that the world was dangerous. "Water," he said, and held the cup to her lips. She drank. The way she drank, long, desperate swallows, hands coming up to grip the cup, told him she hadn't had water in some time. He let her drink until she coughed, then took the cup away and waited while she caught her breath. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was rough, but there was a refinement to it, an education that surprised him. "I'm sorry, too. I didn't mean to fall on your property like that." "Property doesn't mind," he said. "Are you hurt, other than the sun?" She did a slow inventory of herself that he found oddly heartbreaking to watch, the way she checked her own body with careful, assessing hands, as though she wasn't entirely sure what she'd find. "Blisters on my feet," she said. "I think that's the worst of it." "How far did you walk?" A pause. "From Garnet Creek." He kept his face neutral, but Garnet Creek was 14 miles west of here, across open desert. In a wedding dress, in July. He sat back in the chair he'd pulled up beside the bed and looked at her steadily. "My name is Marcus Ashford," he said. "This is my ranch. You're safe here." She met his eyes, and something in the tension of her face shifted slightly, like a door easing back from its frame. "Beatrice Hayes," she said, "and I would like very much to believe that." "Then believe it," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, because the body eventually demands what the mind refuses to concede, she closed her eyes and slept. Marcus sat with her for a while, which he did not examine too closely as a choice. He told himself it was practical, that he was making sure she wasn't going to have some kind of heat-related crisis in the night. He told himself that the way he kept watching the rise and fall of her chest was vigilance, not something else. Then he went outside, fed the horses, made a pot of beans and salt pork, and told himself absolutely nothing at all. In the morning, she was sitting up in the bed when he knocked and pushed open the door, and she had somehow used the water from the basin he'd left her, and made herself as neat as a woman in a ruined wedding dress could reasonably manage. Her hair was back, pinned with what looked like a single remaining pin, and her color was better. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had decided to be composed and was managing it through sheer force of will. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything." "I think I do," she said. "You could have left me at that gate." "No," he said, and his tone was so matter-of-fact that it seemed to give her pause. "I couldn't have." He brought her breakfast: beans, a piece of cornbread, more water, and the last of the coffee, and he sat across from her while she ate with the careful dignity of someone who wanted badly to eat fast but was restraining herself. When she had finished and set the tin cup down, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. "My name is Beatrice Hayes," she began, "and 3 days ago I was supposed to marry a man named Gerald Pritchard in Garnet Creek." "Supposed to," Marcus said. "Supposed to," she agreed. "Gerald Pritchard owns the mill and the grain supply in Garnet Creek and about half the buildings on Main Street. He's 42 years old, and he has a temper that he's careful to hide until there's no advantage in hiding it anymore." She paused. "I am 24 years old, and I have no family left to speak of. My father died last autumn, and my mother has been gone since I was 11. When Gerald Pritchard made his offer of marriage to me, it was not precisely the kind of offer you can decline gracefully when you are a single woman with no income and a rented room and a winter coming." Marcus said nothing. He watched her hands, which were very still in her lap, and understood that stillness as the kind of control that comes from practice. "I told myself I could manage it," she said. "I told myself that many women had made worse arrangements and had built perfectly adequate lives out of them. I had my dress made. I went through all the preparations. And then the morning of the wedding I was sitting in the vestry of the church in Garnet Creek, and Gerald came in before the ceremony was supposed to start, and he spoke to me the way he'd never quite allowed himself to speak to me before." She stopped. "You don't have to tell me what he said," Marcus said. "I know," she said. "But I want to. Because I want you to understand that what I did next wasn't foolishness or hysteria. It was the clearest decision I have ever made in my life." She lifted her eyes to his. "He told me that once we were married, the room I'd been renting would be let to someone else, and all my personal effects would be moved to his house, and that I would have no cause to go into town without his knowledge and company, and that the schoolteacher position I'd been hoping to apply for at the new school being built on Pine Road would naturally not be something I'd be pursuing, since a wife of Gerald Pritchard's didn't need to work, and it would look peculiar." He said all of this in the tone of a man informing someone of a schedule, not a man speaking to a woman he intended to spend his life with. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened in her lap. And then he put his hand on my arm in a way that I knew, right then and there, was a preview of every moment of the rest of my life. And I looked at the door behind him, which was ajar, and I walked out of it. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Outside, Ramai was barking at a jackrabbit on the far side of the fence, and the sound was bright and clean in the morning air. "Good," Marcus said finally. She blinked. "Good. Good that you walked out," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "I had nothing with me," she said. "No money, no bag, just the dress I was wearing. I walked out the church's side door and down an alley and onto the desert road heading east, because east was the only direction where Gerald's properties didn't extend. I walked all day and through the night with very few stops, and by the second morning I was so thirsty and tired I could barely see straight, and I reached your gate." She paused. "And apparently I arrived in a heap." "You did," he confirmed, "but a dignified heap." This time she did smile, brief and startled, as though she'd caught herself at it. "The issue now," she said, pulling herself back to practicality with the determination of someone who has learned not to lean on relief too long, "is that I have nothing. Literally nothing. No money, no belongings, no family to go to, no place to be. I'm a woman in a ruined wedding dress in a stranger's spare room in the Arizona territory, and I need to think of what to do next." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her the way he looked at the land when he was assessing it, not judgmentally but with genuine, careful attention. "I need someone," he said, "to cook and keep house and manage the books for this ranch. I have been managing all of that myself for going on 4 years, and I am a terrible cook and a passable bookkeeper, and I have not had a clean house since my mother visited in '79. He paused. "I will pay you a fair wage, and you will have the spare room, and your time outside of working hours is your own to do with as you please, including applying for that schoolteacher position, if the school in Pine Road is closer to here than it is to Garnet Creek." She stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you walked 14 miles through the desert rather than live a life that wasn't yours," he said. "That's a fair bit of knowing as far as I'm concerned." "That could also mean I'm impulsive and reckless," she said. "Could," he agreed. "Are you?" A pause. "No," she said. "I'm generally very practical." "Then we'll get along fine," he said. He stood up and extended his hand with the directness of a man who had learned to settle things cleanly. "Fair trade. Your work for my wages and a place to live. What do you say?" She looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face, at the steady gray eyes and the jaw that had not been shaved in a couple of days, and the way he held himself, straight but without arrogance, like a man who was comfortable in the space he occupied without needing to dominate it. "All right," Beatrice Hayes said, and she shook Marcus Ashford's hand. "Fair trade." He let her rest for the remainder of that day, and the next morning he gave her a change of clothes, a pair of trousers and a cotton shirt that had belonged to the ranch hand he'd employed 2 years ago, a lean young man named Cal who had moved on to California with the silver boom. The clothes were too large, but they were clean, and Beatrice took them with undisguised relief. He showed her where everything in the kitchen was kept, went over the ledger with her in the afternoon, showed her the land books and the cattle records, and answered her questions. And she had many, sharp and specific, which pleased him in a way he stored at the back of his mind for later examination. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen, identified 3 errors in the accounts that he'd made over the past 6 months, baked bread that made him close his eyes involuntarily when he ate it, and had twice gone out to help him with the horses when she saw he was dealing with a difficult mare alone, and needed a second pair of hands without being asked. She worked the way she'd walked out of that church, with a focused, self-possessed competence that neither required nor invited admiration. He admired it anyway. There was a town 10 miles east called Redbone, which was the nearest settlement to his ranch, and on the second Saturday he drove her there in the wagon to get her her own clothes and any other necessities she required. He gave her 2 months of wages in advance, which she tried to decline, and he refused her refusal with the same matter-of-fact finality he'd used when he'd said he couldn't have left her at the gate. In Redbone, while Beatrice was in the dry goods store, Marcus went to see the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man of 50 named Walt Corbett who had been in the territory long enough to know most of the people in it. "Gerald Pritchard of Garnet Creek," Marcus said. "What do you know about him?" Walt Corbett looked at Marcus with the calculating patience of a man who parses words for a living. "I know enough," he said. "He's got money and he uses it to paper over things that money shouldn't be able to paper over. Why are you asking?" Marcus told him about Beatrice, briefly and without embellishment. Walt Corbett listened with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head. "If he comes looking for her," Marcus said, "I want to know the legal situation." "She's not his wife," Walt said. "They never said the vows. She's a free woman and she owes him nothing. If he tries to claim otherwise, he'd be lying and I'd know it." He paused. "But Marcus, a man like Pritchard doesn't always go through legal channels when he's been embarrassed. You understand me?" "I understand you," Marcus said. He drove home that evening with Beatrice sitting beside him on the wagon seat with a parcel in her lap, wearing a new blue dress she'd changed into at the back of the dry goods store with Mrs. Hanley's permission. And he thought about what Walt had said, and he thought about the woman beside him, who was watching the desert light go gold and copper on the mesa faces with the expression of someone who was allowing herself, cautiously, to feel something like peace. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm usually quiet," he said. "Is it a content quiet or a thinking quiet?" he considered. "Both, tonight." She nodded as though that was a perfectly satisfying answer, and they rode the rest of the way in that quality of silence that is not absence but presence, the silence of two people who are comfortable enough to share the same air without filling it. 3 weeks passed, and then a month. The rhythms of the ranch settled around Beatrice like water finding its level, and she fit into them with a naturalness that Marcus noticed, without allowing himself to think about too directly. She learned the names of all his horses within the first week. The chestnut mare he called Duchess, the roan gelding named Patterson, the pair of bay draft horses, Harold and George, that pulled the wagon. She had a particular rapport with Duchess, who was generally suspicious of people, and he came to the barn one evening to find Beatrice standing with her forehead resting against the mare's neck, eyes closed, one hand moving slowly along the horse's jaw, and both of them perfectly still in the evening light. He backed out of the barn without making a sound, and went to sit on the porch steps and look at the sky, and do some serious thinking about the nature of his situation. He was 31 years old, and he had been alone on this ranch for 4 years, since his younger brother Thomas had gone north to Colorado, and his mother had gone back to Kansas City where she had family. And in those 4 years, he had concluded without particular bitterness that he was probably the kind of man who would stay alone. Not because anything was wrong with him precisely, but because the kind of life he lived out here at the edge of the territory, working the land through seasons that were either too hot or too cold, riding the range in all weather, pouring his effort into something that returned it in the form of survival rather than prosperity, was not the kind of life that attracted a woman looking for comfort. He had made his peace with this. He had built the spare room and put a bed in it and told himself it was practical. And now there was Beatrice Hayes, who had arrived at his gate like a storm and settled into his life like weather you'd been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. He was 31 and she was 24, and he would not do anything stupid. He went inside and ate his supper and did not think about it at all. On a Tuesday evening in late August, about 6 weeks after Beatrice had arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she had her brow furrowed in the particular way she furrowed it when something in the numbers was bothering her, and Marcus was sitting across from her reading a letter he'd received from his brother Thomas. And it was comfortable in the way that things become comfortable when they have been practiced long enough to feel inevitable. "Marcus," she said, "according to these books, you sold your South pasture cattle in March at 30% below market price." "I know," he said. She looked up. "Why?" He folded the letter. "Jim Harrow's family had a bad winter. His wife was sick and he had 3 children and no money to buy feed for his own herd. I bought his extra cattle at market price so he'd have cash to get through, and then I sold the lot of them together when I went to market in March. I didn't want to oversell the lot at once and push the price down further, so I took less." She looked at him steadily. "You cost yourself $200 to help a neighbor." "Approximately," he said. "That's not good accounting," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked back at the ledger and then back at him, and there was something in her expression that was very careful and very warm at the same time. "I see," she said. "It won't be in the books again," he said. "I know how it looks." "It looks like exactly what it is," she said. And she closed the ledger and picked up her coffee and said nothing more about it, but the way she said nothing was the warmest silence he had ever sat inside of. The next afternoon, Beatrice went to Redbone by herself, driving the wagon with a self-taught competence that still occasionally made him hold his breath, and came back in the early evening with a paper in her hand and a brightness in her face that was different from her usual composure. She'd applied for the schoolteacher position at the Pine Road School, and they wanted to speak with her the following week, and the school was 12 miles from the ranch, which was close enough to manage if she had the use of a horse on teaching days. "Of course you do," Marcus said. "Take Duchess. She'll be steadier on that road than Patterson." Beatrice looked at him across the dinner table with those dark, serious eyes. "You are," she said carefully, "an uncommonly decent man." He felt the compliment land somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum and stay there. "I've been told I'm also an uncommonly poor dancer," he said, "so it evens out." She laughed. He had not heard her laugh like that before fully, without reservation, and it did something to the quality of the evening air that he was going to have to think about very carefully later. The interview with the school board at Pine Road went well, and Beatrice was offered the position starting in September at a salary of $35 a month. She came home, and she used the word home, he noticed, without appearing to notice that she'd used it, flushed with something that was undeniably joy. And Marcus opened the last bottle of the good whiskey he'd been keeping since Christmas and poured 2 glasses, and they sat on the porch in the cooling evening and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with work or practicality. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had been a printer and had taught her to set type before she could reach the table without a stool, about how she had come west 3 years ago with a vague and enormous hope of making something new for herself, and had instead found herself in Garnet Creek with no money and the wrong kind of offer. She told him about the books she loved. She had been working through the small collection he kept on the shelf beside the fireplace and had opinions about all of them, and about the kind of classroom she wanted to run, and about the essay she had written in her head on long nights back in her rented room in Garnet Creek about how children in the territories needed a different kind of education than the rote learning methods she'd been taught in Missouri, because the territory was a different kind of place. He told her about the ranch, about how he'd come to the Arizona territory at 24 with the intention of buying cattle land and building something that was genuinely his, about the first terrible winter when everything had nearly gone wrong, about his brother Thomas who had his same eyes and none of his patience, and was probably making someone in Colorado very exasperated right now. He told her about the land itself, which he loved with the quiet, inarticulate devotion that is easier to live than to say, the way the desert looked after rain, the way the mesa turned colors at dawn that he had never found adequate words for. "Show me," she said. "Show you." "In the morning," she said. "Show me the land at dawn." He was awake before sunrise, not because of her, he told himself firmly, and when he knocked on her door she was already up and dressed, and they rode out together on Duchess and Patterson before the sky had fully committed to being light, into the silver gray of the early morning desert. He took her south along the edge of the ranch, where the land rose toward the mesa, and they climbed to a ridge that he knew and stopped there as the sun came up over the eastern mountains, and did what it always did, turned the entire world to shades of fire. He watched her watch it. That was the thing he would remember later when he allowed himself to remember, not the sunrise itself, which he had seen hundreds of times, but the way it moved across her face. "Marcus," she said softly. "I know," he said, and that was all either of them said about it for a long time. Gerald Pritchard came in September. Marcus had been half expecting it. Walt Corbett had sent word 2 weeks earlier that Pritchard was asking questions in the towns east of Garnet Creek, which meant he was working his way along the trail she would have taken. Marcus had prepared for this the way he prepared for bad weather, not with alarm, but with a quiet, methodical laying in of readiness. He was in the yard when the 2 riders came through the gate, and he stayed where he was, standing easy with his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching them come. Pritchard was a thick-set man of 42, well-dressed for the territory in a coat that was too heavy for the September heat, with a face that was handsome in a blunt, proprietary way, and eyes the color of weathered copper. The man riding beside him was hired for the purpose of looking large and saying nothing, which he did very effectively. "I'm looking for a woman named Beatrice Hayes," Pritchard said, without bothering with introductions. I have information she may be on this property. This is my property, Marcus said. Marcus Ashford, and you are Gerald Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, Marcus said, I employ a number of people on this ranch. What's your business with Miss Hayes? She is my fiancée. She is not, Marcus said pleasantly. A fiancée is a woman who has agreed to be married. My understanding is that Miss Hayes made her position on that subject quite clear when she left your church. He paused. I'd call that more of an ex-fiancée situation, which in point of law means she's a woman who makes her own decisions and is none of your business. Pritchard's jaw tightened. I'd like to speak with her. I'll ask if she wants to speak with you, Marcus said. And if she doesn't, you'll be leaving my property. He went inside and found Beatrice in the kitchen, where she had gone very still in the way she went still when she was managing something difficult. He's here, Marcus said quietly. I heard the horses, she said. You don't have to speak to him, he said. If you tell me you don't want to, he leaves. She looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then she smoothed her apron and lifted her chin and said, I'll speak to him. I'd like to say something to him face to face. He went back out with her, and he stood where he was while she walked to where Pritchard sat his horse, and he watched the entire thing without moving, which was the hardest physical thing he had done in recent memory. She looked up at Pritchard with a steadiness that Marcus thought must have cost her something but showed nothing of the cost. Gerald, she said. Beatrice. Pritchard's voice shifted smoother now, the register of a man performing reasonableness. I've been worried about you. I only want to see that you're well and discuss the misunderstanding between us. There's no misunderstanding, Beatrice said. I understood very clearly. That's why I left. You embarrassed yourself and you embarrassed me, he said, and there it was, the smoothness cracking just slightly to let the pressure show. People in that town are talking. What you did was something I had every right to do, she said. I'm not your wife, Gerald. I was never your wife. I made a decision on the morning of that wedding and I stand behind it entirely. I live and work here now. I have a position at the Pine Road School starting this month. I'm not coming back to Garnet Creek. You have nothing, he said, and there was something uglier under the word now. You had nothing when you came out here and you'll have nothing again. I have, Beatrice said, with a clarity that Marcus felt in his spine, exactly everything I need. Pritchard looked past her to Marcus, and the look he gave was the kind that men give each other when they think women are an intermediate object in a conversation between men. Marcus met the look with a flat steadiness that gave it nowhere to land. This isn't over, Pritchard said. Ride off my property, Marcus said, quietly but with an absolute certainty about it. Pritchard looked at him for another moment, then turned his horse and rode back through the gate, his hired man following. The gate swung in the wind behind them. Beatrice stood in the yard watching the dust of their departure, and she was very still and very straight, and then she let out a long, slow breath that was, Marcus thought, the most honest sound he had ever heard. Are you all right? He asked. She turned to look at him. There was something raw and bright in her expression that she made no effort to conceal. I am, she said. I genuinely am. She paused. Thank you for standing there. I wasn't going anywhere, he said. She looked at him for a moment with those dark, serious eyes that saw things accurately and didn't flinch from what they saw. Then she went back inside, and Marcus stood in the yard for a while in the September afternoon, and did not pretend, even to himself, that the feeling in his chest was anything other than what it was. October arrived with the particular mercy of the Arizona fall, when the savage summer heat finally relents, and the air takes on a clarity that makes everything look like it's been cut with a sharp edge against the sky. Beatrice had been teaching at Pine Road for 3 weeks, riding out on Duchess in the early morning and returning in the late afternoon, and in the evenings she sat at the kitchen table and prepared her lessons with the same focused attention she gave everything. And the ranch house felt different in a way that Marcus had stopped trying not to notice. On a Friday evening when she came home from school, she was carrying something, a parcel wrapped in brown paper, which she set on the kitchen table with an air of ceremony. Open it, she said. He unwrapped it. Inside was a book, a volume of Robert Louis Stevenson, newly printed, and inside the front cover she had written in her careful schoolteacher's hand, "For M.A., who showed me what the desert looks like at dawn." B.H. He stood there reading those words for what was probably too long a time. "I ordered it from the Redbone General Store," she said. "It came in today. I thought you read everything on that shelf twice already, and he's a good writer," and she stopped. The composure had developed a slight tremor at the edges, which was new. "I wanted to give you something," she said. "That's all. You've given me considerable, Marcus, and Beatrice," he said. "Yes." He set the book down carefully. He looked at her. She was standing in the kitchen in her blue school dress with her dark hair coming loose from its pins the way it always did by the end of the day, and she was looking at him with that honest, accurate gaze. And for the first time in her face he could see not just the composure but what the composure was holding. "I think you should know," he said, "that this started being not a fair trade about 3 weeks in." She was very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you make this place something different than it was," he said. "I mean that I look for your light in the kitchen window when I come in from the range. I mean that I thought I was a man who would stay alone out here, and that seemed fine to me, and now it doesn't seem fine at all. And I think you should know that because I don't like operating on concealment." He paused. "I'm not asking anything of you. You've had enough of men asking things of you. I'm only telling you what's true because you deserve to know what's true." The silence that followed was the length of a held breath. "Marcus Ashford," Beatrice said slowly, "I have been waiting for approximately 6 weeks for you to say something like that." He looked at her. "You have. You are," she said, "the most quietly stubborn man I have ever encountered. You have been very careful not to say anything, and I have been very careful not to say anything, and we have both been sitting in our careful silence for weeks like two people waiting for the other one to admit it's raining while standing in the rain. Something that might have been described as the relief of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time moved through him. I didn't want to make things complicated," he said. "You just come through a complicated situation." "I know," she said. "And I appreciated the care in that. I did. But Marcus—" She came around the table, unhurried, and stood close enough that he could have touched her without moving much at all. "I chose to stay here. I could have taken my wages and gone to Redbone or Tucson or anywhere. I stayed because I wanted to. Because—" She stopped and looked up at him with a directness that he had never once seen waver in all the weeks she had lived in his house. "Because this feels like mine," she said. "This place. This life. You." He reached out then, carefully, the way he reached for things that were fragile and valuable, and he tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back behind her ear. She turned her face slightly into the touch and closed her eyes for just a moment, and then she opened them and looked at him. And what was in her face was something simple and enormous that matched exactly what he felt. He kissed her with the same straightforwardness he brought to everything, not tentatively, not with the fumbling caution of a man unsure of his welcome, but with a quiet certainty that she answered in kind, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw. When they separated, she was looking at him with that expression that was adjacent to a smile and had now crossed the border. "There," she said, "that wasn't so complicated." "No," he agreed, "it wasn't." She went back to the table and picked up her lesson plan, and he went to the shelf and opened his new book, and they sat in the kitchen in the October evening. And it was the best kind of ordinary, the kind that has been arrived at through something worth arriving from. November brought the first cold, and with it Marcus's brother Thomas. Thomas Ashford arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with no warning, as Thomas did everything, riding in from the north with a grin and a 3-day beard and a saddlebag full of trouble, and he pulled up short at the sight of Beatrice in the yard splitting wood, because she had insisted on learning and was now competent at it, which still mildly alarmed Marcus despite his philosophical convictions about not being the kind of man who alarmed easily. "Well," Thomas said, dismounting and looking between his brother and this woman with an expression of extreme interest, "you didn't write me about any of this." "I wrote you plenty," Marcus said. "Nothing useful," Thomas said, and extended his hand to Beatrice. He was 27, lean and dark-haired, where Marcus was built broader and lighter, and he had the Ashford eyes, that steady gray, though in Thomas's face they danced more. "Thomas Ashford, you must be the reason my brother's letters suddenly stopped sounding like agricultural reports." Beatrice shook his hand with a composure that Marcus recognized as her being quietly amused. "Beatrice Hayes," she said, "I hope you're staying to supper." "I'm staying for a week if you'll have me," Thomas said, glancing at Marcus. "I'll have you," Marcus said. Thomas took over the spare room, which meant Beatrice moved her things to the small storage room that Marcus had cleaned out and furnished for her 3 weeks ago, with a real bed and a proper washstand, and a braided rug that she had looked at when he showed her with an expression he found very difficult to read correctly. She had been in the main spare room until then, which had created a peculiar domestic geography that Thomas's arrival now resolved with cheerful practicality. Thomas was, in his way, an excellent observer. He watched Marcus and Beatrice over supper with the expression of a man doing very precise arithmetic, and by the end of the meal he had apparently reached his conclusions. Later, when Beatrice had gone to bed and Marcus was sitting with Thomas on the porch with the last of the evening's cold coming in, Thomas said, "You're going to ask her to marry you." Marcus considered denying this. "Eventually," he said. "Don't wait too long," Thomas said. "She's got a life. She'll make plans." "She's already making plans here," Marcus said. "She told me last week she wants to apply for the head teacher position at Pine Road when it opens in spring." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Marcus," he said, "you are 31 years old and you have been alone on this ranch for 4 years, and I have never once heard you talk about a woman the way you talked about her just now, which was technically just a sentence about a job application." Marcus said nothing. "Ask her," Thomas said. Marcus looked at the stars over the mesa, which were extraordinary on clear November nights, and thought about Beatrice's face at dawn on that ridge and what she'd written in the front of that book. "I know," he said. Thomas stayed for 10 days in the end, and in those 10 days he repaired the south fence that Marcus had been meaning to get to, won $2 off Beatrice at cards and owed her 3 back by the time he left, and managed to make himself useful in the kitchen at breakfast on the mornings when it was very cold, which surprised everyone including Thomas. He left on a Thursday morning riding north again with that characteristic grin and a promise to write something more informative than usual. "I like your brother," Beatrice said, watching him go from the porch. "He likes you," Marcus said. "He told me so approximately 6 times. "He told me," she said, glancing at Marcus with something careful in the look, "that you're going to ask me something." Marcus looked at her. "He told you that?" "He did." She was watching him with those dark, direct eyes, and there was something in them that was both challenge and warmth in equal measure. "He's extremely poor at minding his business," Marcus said. "He is," she agreed. "Are you going to ask me?" Marcus stood there on the porch in the November morning with the cold coming down off the mountains and the chestnut mare moving in the paddock and the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen, and he looked at Beatrice Hayes, who had collapsed at his gate with nothing and had built herself back up with nothing more than her own considerable self, and who had looked at his land the way he looked at it and who had told him that this place felt like hers. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes. Will you marry me?" There was no hesitation. "Yes," she said, simply, completely, without qualification. "Yes, I will." He reached out and took her hand, and she turned it so their fingers were laced together, and they stood there on the porch in the cold morning air, and neither of them felt the cold. They were married in Redbone in December, in the small church on the main street, which was unadorned and practical and nothing at all like the church in Garnet Creek, where Beatrice had walked out of 6 months before. Walt Corbett was there, and Mrs. Hanley from the dry goods store, and Jim Harrow and his wife, who had come 30 miles to attend, and the school board chairman from Pine Road with his wife, and Thomas, who had ridden down from Colorado with a look of profound satisfaction, and a bottle of very good bourbon from somewhere unspecified. Beatrice wore the blue dress from Redbone, not because she couldn't have had another dress made, but because she chose it. Marcus understood this without needing it explained. She had not bought a new dress for Gerald Pritchard's wedding. She told him the night before, looking at the blue dress on its hook. She had borrowed money for the wedding dress that was now mulch in the Garnet Creek desert, but she had bought this dress for herself, in this town, with money she had earned, and she was going to wear it for her own wedding. He told her she looked beautiful, and he meant it entirely without performance. The ceremony was simple and direct, which suited them both. When the minister said, "Till death do you part," Marcus looked at Beatrice and Beatrice looked at Marcus, and the vow was not a performance of feeling but a statement of already established fact. They went home that evening, and it was home, irrevocably, for both of them, and they ate the wedding supper that Mrs. Harrow had insisted on preparing, and that Thomas had laid on the table with a ceremony that was touching despite being accompanied by a great deal of comic commentary. And after Thomas had gone to the spare room and the house was quiet, Marcus and Beatrice sat by the fire in the front room, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and the fire burned down, and outside the Arizona winter was clear and cold and full of stars. "Do you know what I thought," she said, "when I was walking on that road from Garnet Creek? Tell me. I thought I just need to get somewhere. I don't know where. I just need to be somewhere that isn't that church. And I kept walking because I didn't have any better idea." She paused, "and then your gate was there, and you fell over." "With considerable drama," she agreed. "I did think at one point when I was in the dust and looking up at the sky that this was perhaps not my most dignified moment." "You were dignified," he said. You are," he stopped because language was not his most natural instrument when it mattered. "I'm glad the gate was there," he said. "I'm glad you walked east." She turned her face up to look at him. "So am I," she said. He kissed her then, and the fire was low, and outside the stars were very clear. January arrived with real cold, and with it a letter from Gerald Pritchard. It came addressed to Beatrice at the Redbone post office, and Mrs. Hanley held it for them, and gave it to Marcus when he came in for supplies, with a look that communicated that she had opinions about it. He brought it home and gave it to Beatrice unopened, because it was her letter. She read it at the kitchen table while Marcus stood at the stove, and then she set it down and looked at it for a moment and then picked it up again. "He's heard we're married," she said. "I assumed he would. He says," she paused, "he says a great number of things. Most of them amount to the suggestion that I have made a poor decision and will come to regret it." She set the letter down. "And then at the end he says that he supposes he wishes me well, which I believe is the closest he is capable of coming to graciousness." "Do you want to respond?" Marcus asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "There's nothing useful to say." She paused. "There might have been a time when I needed him to understand what he'd done, but I don't need that anymore." She folded the letter and set it aside. "I have a husband who has never once spoken to me the way Gerald Pritchard spoke to me in that vestry, and I have a classroom full of children who are learning to read, and I have a home I helped build." She looked up at Marcus with a clarity and a warmth in her expression that was so entirely without defense that he felt it as a physical thing. "There's nothing he can say that touches any of that." Marcus crossed to her and put his hand on her shoulder, and she covered his hand with hers, and that was all that needed to happen. Spring came to the Arizona territory with the usual fanfare, the desert blooming in improbable colors, the mountains showing snow at their peaks while the valley below warmed, the cattle restless with the season. Marcus worked the range in the long spring days and came home each evening to a house that was alive in all the ways that houses become alive when people are living in them fully rather than just occupying them. Beatrice had been given the head teacher position at Pine Road, as she'd hoped, starting in the fall. She was rewriting the school curriculum with a thoroughness that intimidated the school board and delighted the students, and she had, in her characteristically practical fashion, found 2 other young women in the area who had some education and recruited them as teachers for the lower grades, which doubled the school's capacity and made the Pine Road School the best in the county within 2 years. She was also, by April, carrying their first child, which she informed Marcus with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting across from him at the supper table one evening, and which produced in Marcus an emotion so large and ungoverned that he had to excuse himself and go stand on the porch for 10 minutes before he was capable of being coherent again. "Are you all right?" she asked when he came back in. "I'm very well," he said, which was inadequate but the best he could manage at that moment. She smiled at him, the full smile, not the adjacent one, and said, "Good. Now eat your supper." He ate his supper with what he recognized as uncharacteristic inefficiency, because he was having trouble keeping his attention on the task. The summer of 1883 moved through the territory in its usual way, burning and brazen, and Beatrice's pregnancy was straightforward. She was strong and healthy, and continued to teach and ride and work with a pragmatism that occasionally alarmed Marcus and consistently impressed him. He moved an additional chest of drawers into the bedroom and built a wooden cradle in the evenings, working in the lantern light while Beatrice sat beside him with a book or her lesson plans, and they talked in that way they had developed, easy, ranging, honest, touching everything from the immediate to the philosophical and back again. She told him more about her father, the printer, who had been a complicated man, intellectually rigorous, personally difficult, the kind of man who could explain the mechanics of the universe, but not how to be kind in small moments. She had loved him anyway with the specific tenderness reserved for people who are imperfect but genuinely trying. She told him about Missouri summers and the smell of printing ink and the weight of the type blocks in her hands. She told him about the books she'd read by lamplight when her father worked late, hiding the candle under the covers so he wouldn't know she was still awake. He told her about his father, who had died when Marcus was 20 and Thomas was 16, and who had been a different kind of man, steady and quiet, and with a great capacity for patience in difficult situations, which Marcus understood now as a gift he had not fully appreciated while it was being given. He told her about learning to ranch in Kansas before coming to the territory, about the seasons that had been bad and the seasons that had been good, and how you learned, eventually, not to let the bad ones convince you the good ones weren't coming. "Is that your philosophy?" she asked one evening, looking at him over her book. "That the good ones are always coming?" "I think you have to act as though they are," he said, "or else you stop putting in the work to be ready for them when they arrive." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I forgot that for a while," she said, "when I was in Garnet Creek. I think I stopped believing the good ones were coming and I started just trying to manage the bad ones." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him and at the room around her and at the growing evidence of the life she was carrying. "Now," she said, "I think I am living proof of your philosophy." Their son was born in September of 1883, a week before the new school year was set to start, which gave Beatrice exactly 4 days to lie in and recover before she was, to Marcus's resigned admiration, sitting up in bed with her lesson plans in her lap and feeding the baby at the same time. They named him William after Marcus's father, but he was called Will from the first week, and he was a dark-haired, gray-eyed child of extraordinary lung capacity, who announced his opinions about the world loudly and without apology from his first moments in it. Thomas came down from Colorado for 3 weeks and held the baby with an expression of baffled tenderness that made Beatrice laugh every time she looked at him. "He looks like both of you," Thomas said, examining Will with the air of a man trying to solve a puzzle. "How does he manage to look like both of you at once?" "Children are surprising," Beatrice said serenely. "He's remarkable," Thomas said, and meant it with a sincerity that made it clear he was not simply being polite. Jim Harrow and his wife came to see the baby and brought a ham and a jar of preserved pears, and Mrs. Harrow cried a little, which she explained was just something she did at new babies, and Jim shook Marcus's hand with the warmth of a man who had not forgotten that Marcus had cost himself $200 to help him through a bad winter. The school opened in September with Beatrice back in the classroom 3 weeks after giving birth, which caused some raised eyebrows among the more traditional members of the community and zero concern whatsoever from Marcus, because he had never wasted energy being concerned about Beatrice's capacity for anything. He arranged for a girl from the Harrow family, a capable 15-year-old named Nell, to come to the ranch on school days and look after Will, which worked excellently for everyone. The ranch was growing. Marcus had been adding to his herd steadily, and with Beatrice's bookkeeping, which was, genuinely, significantly better than his, the accounts were clean and the margins were improving. In the spring of 1884, he bought the parcel of grazing land to the south that had been in dispute with a neighboring claim, and resolved the dispute through a negotiation that Beatrice had coached him on with the thoroughness of a general preparing a campaign. The land doubled his grazing capacity and made the Ashford ranch one of the more substantial operations in the county. She had opinions about everything, and she was usually right, which was a combination that he found endlessly interesting rather than wearying, because her opinions were well-founded and she stated them directly, and when she was wrong, which happened, because she was human, she acknowledged it without drama and adjusted. "You should hire another hand," she told him in the spring of 1884, setting down the ranch accounts with the decisive air of someone who has completed the relevant analysis. "Permanently. Not seasonal. The workload has increased enough that you are consistently doing 15 hours of work on a 12-hour day, and you're going to wear yourself out." "I'm fine," he said. "You are," she agreed, "but you won't be in 2 years if you keep at this rate, and we can now afford it, and there are men looking for steady work." She paused. "And I have been known to help with the horses and the minor maintenance, but I cannot drive cattle and teach school simultaneously, so I am limited in what I can contribute." He hired a hand named Abe Crane, a 40-year-old man from Texas who was methodical and unflappable, and had 30 years of ranching knowledge that he brought to the work with a quiet efficiency that made Marcus think he should have done this 2 years ago. Beatrice fed Abe at their table every evening, and within a week he was part of the rhythm of the place, which was simply the way the Ashford ranch worked. It absorbed people into its way of being without effort. The Pine Road School was, by 1885, the most respected in the territory. 3 classrooms, 6 grades, 4 teachers, and a curriculum that a visiting inspector from Tucson described in his report as unusually rigorous and forward-thinking. Beatrice had written, by this point, 2 long pamphlets on territorial education that had been published by a press in Tucson, and were being used as reference documents by school boards across the region. She wrote them at the kitchen table in the evenings while Will played on the rug and Marcus read or worked on the accounts, and she argued through the ideas aloud as she wrote them, which meant he was something like a collaborator in them, though she attributed all the work entirely to herself. "You should put that you helped," she said once, looking up from the second pamphlet. "I asked 2 questions," he said. "The right 2 questions," she said. "They're the ones that made me reconsider the whole second section." He waved this away. "Your work," he said, "your name on it." She looked at him with that particular expression, the one that was warm and clear and entirely without artifice, and said, "Have I told you lately that I love you?" "You told me this morning," he said. "Then consider this the afternoon installment," she said, and turned back to her writing. Will grew with remarkable speed, as children do, from a loud and opinionated infant to a loud and opinionated toddler who knew the names of all the horses and wanted very much to ride them, which Marcus began teaching him at 3 in the way his own father had taught him, slowly, carefully, with the understanding that patience is the most important thing you can give a child who is learning something real. Beatrice watched this from the fence with an expression that Marcus had learned to read correctly, which was that she was feeling something enormous and keeping it to scale because that was her way, and that what she was feeling was the specific quality of happiness that comes not from a single thing but from the whole accumulated weight of a life that is genuinely, deeply right. In the summer of 1885, Beatrice told him she was expecting again. "Will is going to be insufferable about it," she said. "He already thinks he owns everything within 50 yards. He does own everything within 50 yards, Marcus said. As far as he's concerned. He'll have to renegotiate, she said. Their second child, born in February of 1886, was a girl. They named her Clara, for Beatrice's mother, and she arrived in the world with considerably more tranquility than her brother had, lying in Marcus's arms in the first minutes of her life with an expression of composed assessment that made him think, with a fullness in his chest that he could not have put words to, that she was her mother's daughter. Will, who was 2.5 and had been thoroughly prepared for this development, inspected his sister with a seriousness that was almost comic in a child of that age, and then announced that she was small but acceptable. "High praise from Will," Beatrice said, exhausted and radiant in the bed. "He'll come around," Marcus said. He did. Within a week, Will was fiercely proprietary about Clara in the way that older siblings sometimes are, not kindly, exactly, but with a territorial devotion that was effectively the same thing. By the time Clara was 6 months old, she had Will entirely managed, which Beatrice watched with the expression of someone who recognizes a tactical genius in operation. The ranch in 1886 was a different place than the spare, solitary operation it had been in 1882. The house had been expanded. Marcus and Abe had added 2 rooms in the winter of 1884, proper rooms with real windows and good timber floors, and the yard was full of the evidence of an inhabited life. Beatrice's kitchen garden, which she'd started in her first spring, had grown into a serious enterprise that supplied the table and traded surplus with the Harrow family and 2 other neighboring ranches. The school at Pine Road was running at full capacity. The cattle herd was healthy and growing. And on evenings when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, Marcus and Beatrice sat on the porch they had extended together the summer previous. He doing the carpentry, she doing the measurements and the supervision of the measurements, which had proven to be a necessary distribution of labor, and watched the desert go through its nightly transformation, and talked or didn't talk, and the quality of their silence was still the same as it had been on those first wagon rides into Redbone. Not absence but presence. "Do you ever think about where you'd have been?" she asked him once in the October of 1886 on one of those evenings. Will and Clara were asleep and the night was cool and clear. "Where I'd have been if what?" he asked. "If I hadn't come through the gate that day." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd be here," he said, "working, alone. Probably the same fence would need fixing and the accounts would have the same errors in them and Duchess would still not trust anyone." He paused, but none of the rest of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "None of the rest of it," she agreed quietly. He put his arm around her. The stars over the mesa were extraordinary, as they always were on clear fall nights. Thomas came down from Colorado for Christmas that year with a woman, a composed and direct woman named Harriet who taught at a school in Boulder, and who, Marcus observed, had apparently been a secret existence in Thomas's life for some time. The introduction of Harriet to Beatrice produced an instant and unsettling solidarity between the 2 women that left Marcus and Thomas mildly outnumbered on all domestic discussions for the duration of the visit, which was fine because both of them were usually wrong on those discussions anyway. On the last evening before Thomas and Harriet were to ride back north, the 4 of them sat around the fire after the children were in bed, and Thomas, in the frank way he had always had, said, "I need to tell you 2 something." "That you're going to marry Harriet," Beatrice said. Thomas stared at her. "How did you—" "The ring in his coat pocket," Beatrice said to Harriet. "I noticed it on the second day." Harriet looked at Thomas. "I told you she'd notice," she said. "I'm a school teacher," Beatrice said pleasantly. "I notice everything." Thomas looked at Marcus with an expression of resigned admiration. "Is she always like this?" he asked. "Always," Marcus said, with the contentment of a man who considers this a feature rather than a condition. They celebrated Thomas and Harriet's engagement with the last of the Christmas bourbon, and the evening went long and warm with the particular quality of happiness that belongs to moments when the people you love are all in the same room. A week into January 1887, Walt Corbett rode out to the ranch with news that Marcus had not expected. Gerald Pritchard had sold his properties in Garnet Creek and moved east. No one in the county seemed to know exactly where he'd gone, only that he'd gone quietly and comprehensively, sold everything, packed up, and left without ceremony. "I thought you'd want to know," Walt said, accepting the cup of coffee Beatrice offered him and settling into the chair by the kitchen table with the ease of a man who has visited often enough to be comfortable. "There's no more chance of any kind of trouble from that direction." "There hadn't been any trouble from that direction in some time," Beatrice said. "No," Walt agreed. "But it's still good to know." He paused. He wasn't a good man, but he wasn't a man who held on to lost causes. "I'll give him that much." He looked at Beatrice with the directness of a man who has seen a great deal of the territory and its people. "You made the right call, Miss Hayes." "Mrs. Ashford," she said, with a calm precision that was not correction so much as statement of fact. "Mrs. Ashford," Walt agreed, with a small smile. After he left, Marcus stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard where Will was attempting to teach the dog a trick that Ramai had no intention of learning, and Clara was sitting in the patch of winter sun near the porch steps examining a rock with the serious attention she gave everything. "How do you feel?" he asked Beatrice. She came to stand beside him at the window and looked at the yard. "Like it was a long time ago," she said. "Like a chapter of someone else's life." She paused. "I don't feel anything about Gerald Pritchard anymore. Not anger or relief or anything. He was a man who made a decision about what I should be, and it was the wrong decision, and I left. That's the whole of it." "Good," Marcus said. "Yes," she said. "Good." She leaned briefly against him and then went back to the stove, and he turned from the window and went back to his day. And the kitchen was warm and the children were outside, and the January sky over the mesa was the pale, sharp blue of the cold season. And everything that was his was also everything that was theirs, which was the best kind of belonging. Spring in 1887 came with a new project. Beatrice had proposed, and the Pine Road School Board had agreed, to build a small lending library attached to the school for the use of the community, the first of its kind in the county. She had fundraised through the winter with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and by March she had enough pledge to begin construction. Marcus and Abe built the shelving, and Jim Harrow donated lumber, and Mrs. Hanley at the dry goods store donated a quantity of paper and ink for a catalog. The library opened in April, and the opening was attended by most of the county, because, in a place where entertainment was scarce, a new library was an event. Beatrice stood at the door of the small building and looked at the shelves that held the 112 books that had been donated or purchased by subscription, and she turned to Marcus beside her with an expression that was, he thought, the truest face of joy he had ever seen on another person, the joy of a thing you made yourself, out of effort and belief and other people's willingness to meet you at the task. "My father would have loved this," she said quietly. "I think he does," Marcus said. She squeezed his hand and then went inside to manage the opening with her characteristic organization, and Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment and watched the people of the county fill the small room with their conversation and their curiosity and their reaching hands, and felt the particular gratitude of a man who knows he has been lucky in the things that count. By the summer of 1887, the Ashford ranch was producing well enough that Marcus hired a second hand, a young man of 20 named Eli, who was from a family of freed black men who had come to the territory from Georgia in the late 1870s. The territory was not without its ugliness in these matters, and there were men in the county who had opinions about the composition of Marcus's workforce. Marcus did not engage these opinions with anything but the flat, impassive steadiness he brought to things he had already decided. Eli was a good worker and a decent man, and he sat at the Ashford table in the evenings, and that was the arrangement, and it was not negotiable. Beatrice felt the same way, which was not a surprise. She had addressed the matter in practical terms. Eli worked on the ranch, therefore Eli ate at the ranch. Therefore, Eli was treated with the same respect as anyone else at that table. She said this to Marcus once in the straightforward way she said things that she considered obvious. And then she said it to the one neighbor who had chosen to make a comment, with considerably more edge, and the comment was not repeated. There were injustices in the territory, large and pervasive, and built into the structure of the land itself. The displacement of the Apache and the Navajo, the treatment of the Chinese workers who had built the railroads that now ran through the territory, the ways in which law bent toward money and away from everyone else. These were not things Marcus could fix or Beatrice could fix, though she wrote about some of them in a third pamphlet, and the school she ran did not sort its students by the color of their fathers. They were aware of these things, and they did not pretend they didn't exist, and they did what was within their reach to do, which is not enough and never is, but it was not nothing. In the fall of 1887, Will Ashford started at Pine Road School, which had the peculiar effect of making Will both more and less impressed with his mother. He came home the first week with a complicated expression and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Beatrice with a new assessment. "You're the head teacher," he said. "Mrs. Kelly told me." "I am," Beatrice said. "Everybody does what you say," he said with the tone of someone revisiting a familiar subject from a new angle. "When they're at school, yes," she said. He considered this. "Do they do what you say at home too?" "Ask your father," Beatrice said without looking up from the stove. Marcus, sitting at the table, said nothing. Will looked at him. Marcus continued to say nothing. Will appeared to reach his own conclusions and went off to see about the horses. The following spring, 1888, Beatrice told Marcus she was expecting a third time, and she said it with the same directness as the first and second times, and Marcus felt the same large, ungoverned emotion and managed it slightly better this time, only going to the porch for 5 minutes. "Improving," she called from inside. "Thank you," he called back. Their third child, another boy, arrived in October of 1888. They named him Thomas for Marcus's brother, who received a letter about it in Colorado and wrote back a response of such uncharacteristic sentiment that Marcus read it twice to make sure he'd understood it correctly, and then gave it to Beatrice, who read it and looked as though she might cry, which she did not, but it was close. Young Thomas, Tommy, as he was known immediately to distinguish him from his uncle, was a placid, observant child who looked at the world with a thoughtful attention that was entirely his mother's, and almost immediately had the ranch's second dog, a spotted hound named Pepper, who had arrived as a stray 2 years earlier, completely devoted to him. Will was 5 and a profound authority on all subjects. Clara was 3 and the ruler of all territories. Tommy arrived into this social order with remarkable equanimity and made himself at home in it. Marcus watched all of this with a full heart and the occasional winded expression of a man who had not entirely calculated the scale of what he had agreed to when he'd held his hand out to a woman in a ruined wedding dress and said, "Fair trade." Not winded in regret. He had no register for that, but winded in the way that you are when something is so much better than you expected that the gap between expectation and reality takes the breath. He told Beatrice this one evening, in an unusual moment of verbal expansiveness, sitting on the porch with Tommy asleep in her arms and the older children in bed and the September night doing its usual brilliant work overhead. "I had no idea," he said, "when I said fair trade." "Neither did I," she said. "I thought I was trading labor for shelter. I thought it was a practical arrangement." She looked down at Tommy and then up at the stars. "I had no idea what fair actually meant yet." "And now," he asked. She looked at him. In the lamplight from the kitchen window, her face was as clear and known to him as his own land, every expression mapped and familiar, and still, after 7 years, capable of doing something to him that he would not have expected to be capable of at 31. "Now," she said, "I think fair is not really the word. I think what we have is extravagant. It is the most extravagant thing I have ever been given." He reached across and took her hand, careful of the sleeping child in her other arm. "You gave as much as you got," he said, "Maybe," she said, "but Marcus, I arrived at your gate with nothing." "You arrived with everything," he said. "You just hadn't gotten the chance to use it yet." She was quiet for a moment, and then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. A sound of being so at peace with a thing that it briefly overwhelmed the composure. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the baby slept on in her arms, and the night was cool and full of stars, and the mesa stood in the darkness against the sky like something permanent and faithful. The years after that were the years of a life being lived. Seasons on the ranch, school years at Pine Road, children growing through phases and personalities, neighbors visited and visiting, Thomas and Harriet coming down from Colorado with their own 2 children for holidays and staying too long and being entirely welcome. Ramai got old and slow and spent his last years on the porch in the sun, and when he died Marcus buried him at the edge of the south pasture and said very little about it, and Beatrice said very little about it, and they sat on the porch that evening in a quiet that was also a kind of honoring. Abe Crane stayed with the ranch and became, over the years, as essential to its operation as the land itself, and eventually Marcus gave him a share in the breeding program, a formal stake, documented in the accounts in Beatrice's clear hand, because the arrangement had moved beyond employer and employee into something that had its own particular dignity and deserved to be acknowledged with more than wages. Eli stayed too, and in 1891 he married a woman named Ruth who was a teacher at a school in a neighboring community, and Beatrice and Ruth became the kind of friends who challenge each other and agree on most things that matter and disagree productively on the rest. And their ongoing argument about the best method of teaching arithmetic to 6-year-olds was conducted over enough dinner tables that both their families could recite both positions from memory. Will grew up direct and capable and more interested in the land than in school, which his mother observed with the pragmatism of a woman who knows that different minds go different directions, and she taught him everything she could teach him and let the land teach him the rest. Clara grew up with her father's steadiness and her mother's precision, and at 13 was already the kind of person who entered a room and quietly reorganized it for the better. Tommy grew up slow and thoughtful and turned out to have a gift for mathematics that startled even Beatrice, and she recognized it early and fed it carefully with problems that stretched him without breaking him. In the spring of 1892, a man from a Tucson press came to speak to Beatrice about collecting her 3 educational pamphlets into a formal volume with additional essays to be published and distributed across the territory. She sat at the kitchen table after he left and looked at Marcus with an expression he could not entirely read. "What?" he said. "He wants to publish my work," she said. "I know, I was sitting right there." "Properly," she said. "A real book." "Yes," he said. Also something I already knew, being present in the room for the conversation. She looked at him, and then she looked at the table, and then she looked at him again. "I wrote those pamphlets at this table," she said. "I wrote them while Will was on that rug and you were doing the accounts and there was coffee on the stove." "I know," he said. "I wrote them because I had things I needed to say and no one was stopping me from saying them," she said. "Because I had a home and a life that were genuinely mine, and from that place I could," she stopped. "I could do things I would never have done from the other place, from Garnet Creek, from that vestry." She looked at him steadily. "You made that possible. This ranch and this marriage, and you made it possible." "You made it possible," he said. "I just opened the gate." She shook her head slightly, but she was smiling, the full smile, the one that arrived without warning even after 10 years, and still did the same thing to the quality of the air. The book was published in 1893 under the title Education in the Territories, Principles and Practice, by Beatrice Ashford, formerly Hayes, and it was reviewed favorably in 3 Tucson papers and 1 Phoenix paper, and referenced in a report to the territorial legislature on the state of public education. Beatrice received a copy of the first printing on a Thursday afternoon, and held it the way you hold a thing that has weight both actual and otherwise, and Will, who was 9 and developing opinions about books, asked if he could read it, and Beatrice said absolutely not yet. It was for adults, and Will asked why she got to decide, and she said because she wrote it and he should go help Abe with the fence, and he went, muttering. Marcus looked at his wife sitting at their kitchen table with her book in her hands, and the afternoon light coming through the window she'd insisted on enlarging when they redid the kitchen in 1889, and he thought about the woman he'd carried through the gate 10 years ago, the torn dress and the cracked lips and the wary, assessing dark eyes, and the distance between that moment and this one. Not a transformation. That was not quite the word for it. More like a flowering, a thing that had always been in the seed, finding finally the right soil. He made coffee and brought her a cup and sat across from her, and she looked up from the book and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee. For everything," she said. "For every fair trade we've ever made." He looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman who had walked 14 miles through the Arizona desert in a ruined wedding dress and arrived at his gate with nothing and rebuilt herself into someone extraordinary, and who had in doing so quietly and entirely transformed the life of the man she had found waiting there. "I got the better end of everyone," he said. "We'll argue about that," she said. "We will," he agreed. "Later, drink your coffee." She drank her coffee, and outside Will was arguing with Abe about something related to the fence, and Clara was reading on the porch, and Tommy was at the kitchen table with his arithmetic, and the Arizona afternoon was doing what Arizona afternoons do in the late spring, burning golden and enormous and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have earned your attention and hold it without effort. And Marcus Ashford sat in his kitchen with his wife and his children and the life they had built together from a single moment of mercy at a gate, and he felt the full and uncomplicated weight of it. Not a fair trade, better than fair. The best trade that had ever been made on this land, in all the long years of its making. And the mesa stood red and ancient outside the window, and the desert bloomed in its unreasonable colors, and the coffee was hot, and the afternoon went on, and everything was right.